After the fall of Okinawa in 1945, it became clear that the Japanese wouldn't surrender, and invasion of the Japanese home islands would be necessary. The invasion of Japan had the codename Operation Downfall, which itself consisted of Operation Olympic, the invasion of the southernmost island Kyushu, and Operation Coronet, the invasion of the Japanese mainland. In this video, we'll look at Operation Olympic. First, let's look at the terrain and location. Kyushu is located 560 kilometers north of Okinawa, which was the battle with the most losses in the Pacific during World War II. Now, similar to Okinawa, Kyushu featured mountains, steep ravines, and had plenty of natural caves, thus providing a perfect terrain for the Japanese to dig in and hide, which would have limited the US superiority in artillery, close air support, and even strategic bombing. Of course, the island also had some benefits for the attacker. Strategically, it provides a natural harbor, the Kagoshima Bay in the south, plenty of airfields, thus an ideal location for assembling further troops and conduct operations. On the operational level, there were plenty of beaches and no barrier reefs, which made it ideal for an amphibious landing. The plan for the invasion was set for around November 1945. One reason was that after Okinawa, the US wasn't able to launch another major amphibious operation immediately, and the other reason was that the typhoon season in summer lasted 4 months. But let's look at the invasion plan. The US 6th Army would conduct 3 simultaneous corps-sized landings, with a total of 9 divisions. In comparison, D-Day was conducted with 6 divisions landing on the beaches and 3 airborne divisions. The 5th Amphibious Corps would land with 3 US Marine divisions on the western shore. The 11th Corps of the Army would land at Ariake Bay, and the 1st Corps of the Army on the eastern shore, both with 3 divisions. The plan was to secure the lower third of the island, secure the harbor and various airfields. Additionally, there were 2 divisions ready as a follow-up force, 2 more reserves, and 2 for a divisionary threat to Shikoku. Due to the experience from Okinawa, 5 days prior to the invasion, various offshore islands should be taken by US troops. For this, 1 division was assigned. The control of these islands should provide several benefits, namely reduce the threat of suicide boats, provide early warning against kamikaze attacks, and also provide fallback positions for damaged ships. The sheer scale of the invasion was enormous. The total number of troops was around 650,000 men. In terms of amphibious and support force, it would have involved more than 4,000 ships and craft, of which 2,700 were part of the assault shipping. In comparison, the total number of ships involved in D-Day was 2,727 ships. Among the ships for Operation Olympic were 972 landing ship tank (LST), which could carry around 10 to 20 tanks depending on the variant, and 1,080 smaller landing craft tank (LCT), which could carry a few tanks each. Note that both came many variants and could be loaded quite differently, so take these numbers with a grain of salt. These huge numbers are in stark contrast to the total of 51 to 75 ships and craft at Guadalcanal in 1942. One major concern for the US were the assumed number of losses. There were various assessments, and since the number of Japanese troops on the island increased considerably over time, you should take all these estimates with a grain of salt. The early conservative estimates of the US losses were around 60,000 casualties, of which 15,000 would be KIA for the first 60 days. General MacArthur's estimate for the first 90 days was 105,500 battle casualties and an additional 12,600 non-battle losses, although this number was later denied. These numbers are probably best understood with some more information. Namely, the US divisions involved in Olympic so far had sustained in the Pacific a total loss of 47,239 casualties, of which 17,861 were deaths. As you can see, the numbers are rather high, and this was just for the first 60 or 90 days and just a part of Kyushu, not the whole of Japan. Due to the high expected losses, the US commanders were searching for various methods to reduce them. This included the use of non-conventional weapons, which is something I covered in a special video that is linked above. Now, similar to D-Day, the US used plenty of deception techniques to mislead the Japanese about their intended target. For instance, the use of bogus radio transmissions and overflights on other islands. Additionally, the US tried to make sure that the Japanese thought that the invasion would contain a large amount of airborne assault forces. This was done so that the Japanese would have located more of the units inland away from the beaches. Yet the Japanese correctly assumed that Kyushu would be the next target. The US advantages were clear. Kyushu was in range of tactical planes from Iwo Jima and Okinawa. Additionally, it had plenty of airfields and a natural harbor that would serve as an ideal place for a staging of an invasion of the Japanese mainland. Much to the dismay of the US commanders, the Japanese concentrated most of their troops in the southern part of Kyushu, which was the exact area where the landings should be conducted. So let's look at the Japanese preparations. The build-up on Kyushu was extensive. In April 1945, around 2 or 4 infantry divisions, depending on the source, were stationed on the island. In August, this number has risen to 14 divisions, 5 independent brigades, and 3 armored brigades. Although according to the map on Gian Greco's Hell to Pay, I counted 13 brigades on Kyushu, although some of them were located on various offshore islands, as you can see here. Yet the number of divisions is identical, although due to the space issue, they are not displayed here. I assume some of the brigades shown here don't count as independent. Anyway, in total around 600,000 troops were estimated to be located on the island in mid-August 1945, and most of them stationed in the south. This was frightening news for the US commanders because the number of defenders was almost matching the number of attackers. Additionally, the Japanese build-up was not finished. These numbers were for August, but the invasion itself was scheduled for around November. And the Japanese were continually raising new troops. The new soldiers soon found themselves undergoing the same exhausting routine of their predecessors in Okinawa, Iwo Jima, Peleliu, Tarawa, training all day, digging fortifications half the night. Now, not all divisions were newly raised. Early on, 2 veterans divisions from the Kwangtung Army in China were transferred to Kyushu. Of course, training, supplies, and equipment of the Japanese troops was far below US standards. Nevertheless, the Japanese were able to stockpile a sufficient number of supplies and ammunition. They dispersed their supplies and underground caches, thus reducing the effectiveness of US bombing attacks. And overall, the preparations were quite successful, although the number of combat divisions was continually rising over the months. By the end of July, the 16th Area Army had an estimated 80% of the base construction completed, and about 70% of the supplies were available. Yet the Japanese knew that their supplies were limited. American plans of a 1st November assault date ironically coincided with the Japanese preference for an invasion during the fall of 1945. Otherwise, high-ranking Japanese officers feared stockpile supplies would be consumed and troops would run short of rations should the invasion be postponed until the following spring. A short reminder here, the Japanese already in December 1940 started the ration of sugar, 1 year before Pearl Harbor. A few months later, after sugar, rice was also rationed. Fruits, vegetables, salt, and even matches were added later. Considering that by March 1945, 74% of the Japanese merchant fleet was sunk and the US bombed the Japanese islands continuously, you get an idea of the dire situation of the Japanese. Yet surrendering was still not an option for the military. Now, in order to cope with the limited amount of equipment and ammo, the Japanese used various measures. They organized the divisions in 3 types. The 100 series divisions were coastal defense units fighting near the Allied landing zones. They would be sitting in simple earth and wooden field fortification or at best in concrete pillboxes. The mission was to hold the ground until the more mobile Japanese divisions could conduct a counterattack. Thus they were equipped with a limited number of heavy weapons and almost no vehicles. In short, they were human breakwaters to the invaders' tide. Sooner or later they would be washed away. The 200 series divisions were mobile divisions for the counterattack. They were well equipped with heavy artillery, mortars, automatic weapons, mines and other weapons. Furthermore, they had a good amount of combat engineers. Then there were the 300 series. They were like the 100 series, yet with even less heavy weapons. Since Drea already considered the 100 series a breakwater unit, you can imagine how well the 300 series were. Since ammunition was quite an issue, not all divisions were provided with a full load of ammo. Only the line units received 100% of ammo, the maneuver units would only receive 50%. Now let's look at the Japanese defensive doctrine. Originally, the Japanese defensive doctrine against amphibious attacks was to destroy the enemy at the beaches as soon as possible. This was later changed, most notably at the Battle of Peleliu, to a protracted defense that grew stronger the deeper the enemy forces entered the island, which resulted in attrition warfare. For the defense of Kyushu, the defensive doctrine was switched back to the original approach to try to eliminate the enemy once he stepped on the beaches. The 100 and 300 series division should fix the enemy in the landing areas, whereas the 200 series mobile divisions should counterattack. Closing in, the US troops should ensure that the US superiority in artillery and naval gunfire should be limited. Another major part of the Japanese plans and preparations was the use of suicide attacks. This included civilians running with mines against tanks, suicide boats, manned torpedoes, the Kaiten, and kamikaze planes. Already during the Battle of Iwo Jima, the Japanese inflicted major damage on the US fleet by sinking one escort carrier and putting a fleet carrier out of action for the rest of the war. Yet for the defense of Kyushu, it was planned to send 200 to 300 planes against the landing fleet every hour. And this time the Japanese would have a greater number of planes at their disposal, around 4,000 to 6,000 kamikazes and additional several thousand aircraft for support. Additionally, the Japanese changed their tactics. First off, warships were not their primary target anymore. The main goal was to sink the invasion fleet, the transport ships and the landing craft. Now let's put these numbers in perspective. The latest kamikaze attacks were at the Battle of Okinawa, during which 10 major kamikaze attacks were carried out. Since around 1,900 kamikaze planes were used, that is an average of 190 planes per attack. Additionally, a major part of the attacks came from Kyushu itself, so the infrastructure was already set up. To quote from the US Strategic Bombing Service about the Okinawa campaign, a total of approximately 4,000 Japanese planes were destroyed in combat, of which 1,900 were suicide planes. The violence of these attacks is further revealed by the damage inflicted on the United States forces. Of 28 ships sunk by air attack, 26 were by kamikaze planes. Of 225 damaged by air attack, 164 were by this means. Practically all of these attacks were directed against ships. So for Olympic there would be around 2 to 3 times as much kamikaze planes, additionally they would be far closer. Yet there's another interesting aspect where the devil is clearly in the detail. The Japanese used a large variety of planes, like float planes, obsolete biplane arenas, manned guided bombs like the Oka/Baka, and regular military aircraft. Although at first you might think biplanes were not a threat, yet they had a distinctive advantage. Most of them couldn't be picked up by radar, and additionally pilots were training for night operations. Since the US proximity fuse used in anti-aircraft shells were using radar, this severely decreased the effectiveness of the AA defense. Another aspect was the large amount of different aircraft. This would have probably severely lowered the effectiveness of the fire control systems to the very different speeds of the planes. Additionally, many of the pilots were previously trainer aircraft, thus thousands of experienced pilots were added to the pool of kamikaze or at least the support pilots. The focus on nighttime attacks also would have had further implications and probably affected the overall combat effectiveness of the US Navy. Throughout the war, aerial attacks at night had been extremely infrequent and sailors looked forward to the hours of darkness, even more so after the advent of the kamikaze, as a time of relative freedom from fear of death from above, as they were damaged, took on supplies and grabbed some sleep. Now you probably might argue, well, this is just a theory and kamikaze attacks with biplanes by night wouldn't have been a serious threat. Well, actually with biplane nighttime kamikaze attacks, one destroyer was sunk and one heavily damaged in July 1945. Considering such an attack could sink a destroyer which is an armed and armored warship, similar attacks against landing ships and support craft which were far less protected were a severe threat. The Japanese Navy expected to destroy around 30 to 50% of the invasion fleet with these attacks. The army was more conservative and assumed only 15 to 20%. Yet that would still mean around 3 complete divisions destroyed at sea, which would be 1/3 of the initial landing force. Of course, we cannot know what would have happened, although we know that the US military leadership was very concerned about the possibility of an invasion. After all, due to intelligence program and capture of Japanese codebooks, the US military was informed rather well on the Japanese preparations. Thus you probably very well understand why the military historian Edward Drea called it the previews of hell. Luckily, the unconditional surrender by the Japanese in August 1945 prevented the invasion of Japan, and thus Operation Olympic never came to be. Thus a huge number of lives was spared. Indeed, Japanese commanders assured junior officers that counterattacking the invaders would be a most splendid way to die, because it may be hard to imagine 50 or 70 years later does not make it any less true. When word got around that the bombs had forced the Japanese surrender, we knelt in the sand and cried. For all our manhood we cried. We were going to live, we were going to grow up to adulthood after all.